Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Covenant Presbyterian Church's adult education class for Sunday, January 23rd. Today we're going to have a part of our series called Let's Talk About Sex, and we are talking about theological reflections about sex and sexuality, and we have some very special guests today who are going to tell us and teach us a little bit more about what they do at OutReach and how we can use terminology and words in a more comfortable and respectful manner. Kristi Mason and Linda Lenzke will lead us with that presentation today. They are from OutReach LGBTQ Community Center in Madison. So with that, I will hand it over to both of you and let you get started.
Okay, I think I'll need to share my screen. So give me a moment to do that. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I want to say thank you for having us today and welcome to LGBTQ Plus 101, which is a presentation of OutReach Community Center. For some reason, I am unable to, there we go. So my name is Kristi Mason, and I have a master's in social work, and I'm the LGBTQ plus senior advocate, which means I work with adults in our community who are over the age of 50. And I'll allow my colleague to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Linda Lenzke, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the LGBTQ plus alcohol and other drug addiction advocate at OutReach. I've been sober, recovering from alcohol, substances, and behaviors that no longer serve me for over 35 years. And I identify as a lesbian, and I came out over 40 years ago. And I want to just mention that I am very open to questions, and that Kristi and I are going to try to answer questions at the end of the presentation. So feel free to either put your questions in the chat or wait till the end of the presentation, and we will make sure we try to answer all questions. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about a lot of different things. We're going to talk a little bit about outreach. We're going to talk about the power of labels in self-identifying in the LGBTQ plus community. Then we'll talk about a lot of different labels, some of which you'll know and some of which will hopefully be new to you. And we'll talk about a little bit about LGBTQ 101, sort of navigating diversity within the LGBTQ plus community. And then we'll talk about how to be an ally. So a little bit about outreach. We are the Madison LGBTQ plus Community Center. And so we work with all ages, usually 18 and up, but we can also work with families if they need referral and resources. We offer peer counseling from one of our 3 advocates, Linda Lenzke, our AODA advocate. We have a transgender health advocate, and then there's myself, the senior advocate. We offer social and support groups, some of which are the Madison Area Transgender Association, otherwise known as MATA. We offer Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon for LGBTQ plus individuals. And for LGBTQ plus seniors, we offer Gay, Gray, and Beyond, which is a discussion group and a spirituality group that meets once a month. We also offer a speakers bureau and cultural competency training such as this one. We have a huge lending library. We have an online directory that provides connection to area LGBTQ plus friendly services and businesses. And we offer community meeting space for LGBTQ plus friendly groups. And so Linda will talk a little bit about the power of labels.
Great. Next slide, please. Labels that we choose self-identify and are objective. Labels can be inclusive, and we really support people for using inclusive labels. They provide a common language for a shared experience. They reduce the kind of isolation, alienation, loneliness, and depression that many LGBTQ people have experienced. And they define the characteristics of a group. Labels, on the other hand, unfortunately, can be exclusive, and they provide a basis for invalidating others. They increase the very things we're trying to reduce, which is isolation, alienation, loneliness, and depression. And they're used to other groups of people. Unfortunately, it's a way of comparing and contrasting and making someone the other. Next slide, please. The acronym for LGBTQ+, and you're going to hear us stumble over all those letters, LGBTQ+, a number of times in this presentation. But what those letters stand for are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, asexual or allies, and then the plus sign is to be inclusive of all others. Language is dynamic, and in this particular application, it is changing almost daily. LGBTQ+ is meant to be inclusive of all who do not fit into the traditional heterosexual sex and gender definitions. Closeted is a person who doesn't reveal or is in denial about their gender identity or sexual orientation. Next slide, please. In the past, some labels were used in ways that were or continue to be stigmatizing. An example is queer. Another example is, even though homosexual was once a medical term, it's also used sometimes in a disparaging way. Self-identifying is subjective, complex, and a very personal process. Asking someone how they self-identify is a sign of respect and acceptance. Asking someone what their pronouns are and then using them is a sign of respect and acceptance. And that's becoming more accepted even in organizations and bureaucracies like government. New ways of self-identifying are always evolving, hence the plus sign at the end of LGBTQ+. When in doubt, ask, don't assume or guess. As someone who's a baby boomer, that's one of my biggest challenges, because I will sometimes visually guess at someone's preferred identity and guess wrong, because they may present themselves differently than how they personally identified. Next slide.
So now we're going to talk about a lot of definitions. And the first definition we're going to talk about is gender and gender versus sex. So gender just refers to socially created roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities. So the socially created is the most important part. It's created by each culture and each society. We are socialized to accept our culture's concept of gender as ideal or normal. But actually, expectations and roles can vary from culture to culture. In this culture and in many Western European cultures, women are expected to be shy and demurring and not easily prone to anger, whereas men can be more aggressive and assertive. That's a cultural expectation. But gender is subjective. Another term you're going to hear a lot is gender binary. So gender binary refers to a spectrum where you have male at one end and female at the other, with nothing in between. When in fact, there are many genders in between that spectrum and outside that spectrum, and we'll be talking about that. But many cultures acknowledge more than two genders. some Native American cultures acknowledge as many as 5 genders, and there are thousands of these cultures that acknowledge more than 2 genders all around the world. I've just listed a couple of them, and I won't mess up some of their names by trying to pronounce them, but it's something you can Google and you can find out a lot more about. So sex, on the other hand, gender being a social construct, sex is a person's physical or biological assignment of male or female at birth by medical professionals. So the baby is born, the doctor looks at the genitalia and says, congratulations, it's a boy, it's a girl. That's based on genitalia, but sex can also be determined by chromosomes and primary sex characteristics and sex organs. And that means biology is much more diverse. So there's male, there's female, there's also intersex. Intersex people comprise about 1% of the population. And they are people who are born with ambiguous genitalia, or they're born with external genitalia for one sex and internal genitalia for another, or they're born with a chromosomal abnormality that just makes it impossible to assign male or female to that person. They are somewhere else on the spectrum or outside the spectrum. Gender identity is how a person understands or experiences their personal gender. So a lot of children know their gender identity by the age of 4 or 5. And but this, for some people, changes over a lifetime. So it's how you experience who you know yourself to be, and how a person navigates a culture's conceptions of gender. So do you choose to present as the sex you were assigned at birth, or do you choose to present as the gender that you experience yourself to be, your gender identity? It's also how a person wants to be perceived by others. So we all want a certain amount of congruity between how we experience ourselves on the inside and how we experience ourselves on the outside. There are 3 gender identities: transgender, genderqueer, non-binary, and cisgender, and we'll talk about those things. But for the purposes of the LGBTQ plus community, the thing to remember is if someone identifies their gender identity as male, that person is considered a man. If someone identifies their gender identity as female, that person is considered a female. And you use the pronouns to address them and the name that they have chosen that is consistent with their gender identity. So a transgender person is a person whose gender identity, how they experience themselves, differs from their sex assigned at birth. So the acronym MTF refers to a person who was born a male but who identifies as a female and would be considered in the LGBTQ plus community as a woman. FTM is a person who was born as a female but identifies as a male. Sometimes we use the word, instead of transgender, we use the words trans man or trans woman to refer to someone who is transgender. You can use those interchangeably. And trans people often transition in at least one of 3 ways. So there's the emotional transition of coming out to yourself and saying, okay, I experience myself as female, even though my sex assigned at birth was male. That's the emotional transition. But there's also the medical transition that involves the taking of hormones, psychotherapy, and various other medical things that are recommended or required for people. Finally, there's a surgical transition that involves surgical gender confirmation surgery. But it's important to know that not all trans people either feel the need to transition or are able to make the medical and surgical transition because of the cost and because of the difficulty of getting insurance to cover it. So 2 other terms are gender dysphoria, which is the this feeling of distress or unhappiness that a person experiences when there's a conflict between gender identity and sex assigned at birth. And then there's gender euphoria. That's the feeling of joy or happiness when one's gender identity is validated. That can be, and there are different ways that that occurs, but it can be the wearing of fingernail polish for men. It can be the wearing of appropriate undergarments that are consistent with your gender identity. It can be a variety of things. Gender queer or non-binary just refers to existing or identifying outside the gender binary. So outside that male, female, or somewhere in the middle. So it's neither male or female. It's multiple genders at the same time. It's experiencing flowing between genders, which is known as gender fluid, or it's experiencing being a combination of male and female. But it can also be an umbrella term. So it's important to just remember that if somebody uses that term to refer to themselves, that's how you should refer to them moving forward. Cisgender is somebody whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth. I identify as a cisgender lesbian. So my gender identity is female. It matches my sex assigned at birth, but I'm also a lesbian. There's cisgender male, there's cisgender female, and then there's cisgender intersex, a person who identifies as intersex and whose biology matches their gender identity as an intersex person. The term cisgender we use instead of the word normal, because normal implies that trans folks and non-binary folks are somehow abnormal, and that just isn't true. So cisgender privilege refers to the benefits that result from the alignment of your gender identity and your sex assigned at birth. So I experience a number of cisgender privileges. A couple of examples are which I can go in to any store or any place of business, and I can walk into a women's restroom or a women's dressing room and no one gives me a hard time. No one makes comments about my appearance. No one makes comments about my name or my pronouns. That's just some of the cisgender privilege I experience as a cisgender lesbian. So gender expression is how we communicate our gender to others. It's the way in which gender is expressed, and that cues others into how we would like to be perceived. And so there's female gender expression, male gender expression, and androgynous gender expression, which is being either both masculine or feminine in your expression, being neither masculine or feminine in your expression, or being somewhere in between. So there are two modes of gender expression. There's private gender expression. So my private gender expression is thinking of myself in a certain voice. It's if I had a different gender identity, it would be maybe wearing different undergarments that a male would wear, or binding my chest to appear flat like a male. It would be for male to female, it would be painting your toenails, even though no one else is going to see it. Wearing, like I said, certain types of underwear, lingerie, picking an avatar, little things can be private gender expression. Public gender expression is choosing the gender of the name you share with others. It's the way you style your hair. It's whether you wear makeup. It's the type of clothes and fragrance you wear. It's about having that consistency between how we experience ourselves inside and how we experience ourselves on the out, and how others experience us on the outside.
Sexual orientation. I'm going to talk about that. Next slide, please. Sexual orientation. There are definitions that talk about the direction of a person's sexual interest towards people of the opposite sex, the same sex, both sexes, or regardless of gender. It's one's tendencies of sexual attraction considered as a whole. It also includes how intensely or often an individual experiences sexual attraction, how intensely or often an individual's sexual attractions change or fluctuate, like that's part of the gender fluid. and gender fluid orientation. Then there are conditions under which an individual can experience sexual attraction. Adults are 2 or 3 more times likely to say that they have a same-sex attraction or have engaged in same-sex behavior than they are to identify as LGBTQ+. When Kinsey did his groundbreaking study, that was one of the results that he had, is that many people considered themselves to be heterosexual, though they may have had same-sex attractions or engaged in some kind of same-sex behavior. Next slide, please. These are kind of simple, but they're important to kind of just restate. A lesbian is a woman who is attracted to other women. A point to be made, though, is that if there is a male to female trans woman, she can also be a lesbian. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out. Similar percentages of men and women identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Next slide. Gay refers to a man who's attracted to other men. And in this case, that could be a female to male trans man who is also attracted to men. But that female to male trans man may also identify as bisexual, lesbian, gender fluid, or the whole list. It can also refer to the LGBTQ+ community as a whole, anyone who is not straight. A lot of people for a long period of time, when they stopped using the word queer or homosexual, substituted the all-encompassing term of gay to describe the LGBTQ+ community. Next slide. Bisexual is a person who is attracted to 2 genders. Pansexual is sexual attraction regardless of gender. A really quick story. When my niece turned about 16, she announced at a family gathering, "I'm pansexual." Everyone in my family, for the exception of me, kind of big gaping mouths and wondering, like, what the heck is that? Especially my 91-year-old father, her grandfather. And fortunately, her mother, my sister, is very open and accepting, but wanted more information. So we spent some time at a family gathering talking about what pansexual meant. And for my niece, for her, it meant that she could be attracted to anyone regardless of their gender, that she had already in her young life had experienced attractions, even though she may not have acted on them. She was attracted to people who identified as male, as people who identified as female, people who may have identified as gender fluid. That's changing for her. And that's one of the things I want people to remember. For my 16-year-old niece, who is now going to be 18 very shortly, I don't think she considers herself pansexual anymore. I think she's now kind of defined herself as bisexual, because she's had relationships with men and relationships with women. Over half of LGBTQ people identify as bisexual. We're going to talk a little bit about some general terms and how they interact with each other. So this part of the presentation is going to start out with gender, the genderbread person. I really like this illustration, and some of what Kristi's already shared with us kind of addresses this. There are 4 main areas that define us. One is our gender identity, and some of us will identify I'm a woman, some will identify I'm a man, and some will identify somewhere in between, which would be gender queer or gender fluid. So there's a whole continuum. Then there's the gender expression, how we dress, how we externally appear to the world that we interact with. Some of us will identify as feminine, others masculine, and then in the middle is androgynous. I came out in the late 1970s. That was a time when feminism was informing people who were coming out, but also informing people who were considered themselves women, who considered themselves feminists, and androgyny was really kind of the status quo at the time. At some point in the past, butch femme was part of our LGBTQ plus community, but that started to be frowned upon because of some of the political implications, the power indifferences. So androgyny was sort of de rigueur at the time. Then there's our biological sex. And as we've learned, people can be born female or male or somewhere in between as an intersex person. I am an intersex person. At birth, when I was born, the doctor said to my mother and dad, "You have a beautiful daughter." When I was at the age of 4, I had a hernia, and my internal organs did not match my external organs. And I had to have surgery when I was a teenager to make sure that my external gender and my internal gender matched. I have always, throughout my whole life, identified as a woman, and I had been married to a man early in my adult life, but then I came out as a lesbian. So today I identify as a female, lesbian, intersex person, she, her, and hers. Then we have sexual orientation, where, as I just described, there was at one point in my life, I would have described myself as a heterosexual. And then later, when I came out as a lesbian, medically, from the psychiatric community, I would have been considered a homosexual. And I never, ironically, considered myself bisexual. Even though I had been married to a man and came out as a lesbian, it was really clear that that early experience was unique to that person, and that I identified throughout the rest of my life, and I do so today as a lesbian. So this is really important. As you can see by the graphic of the little genderbread person, identity happens in the brain, orientation happens in the heart, sex happens in the genitalia, and expression is like how we present ourselves as a whole person. Next slide, please. So coming out is the process by which one accepts or comes to identify one's own sexual orientation or gender identity. There are two separate processes. One is coming out to oneself, which usually takes a long time. I was still married. I became very active as a feminist, and I started coming out over a period of time as I found my attraction was to women. Later, when I made the decision that yes, in fact, I am a lesbian, then I came out to others. And that can also come out over time as well. I came out to my immediate circle of friends and then my family. What's really important in this process of coming out is making your insides match your outsides, and vice versa, actually. Some LGBTQ people wait, and these are older, typically older LGBTQ people, wait until their children have grown or their partner has died to come out to others. Next slide. So here are some of the feelings and behaviors associated with coming out. A lot of people experienced internalized homophobia at the early stage of coming out. There's experiences of isolation, fear, anger, stress. Once you've come out and accepted it yourself, often there's relief. But there can continue to be some degree of uncertainty and often some depression. The behaviors associated with coming out are sometimes people drop out of school. This is particularly true of a lot of young people who are not supported by their families or by their communities and their schools. Leaving home or forced homelessness, this happens to a lot of young people and unfortunately contributes to adolescent suicides. Self-inflicted violence. A lot of people will start cutting or doing other behaviors that are not good for them, their bodies. Increased drug and alcohol abuse. That reflects a behavior that I experienced. I had a drinking issue that was a genetic predisposition before I came out, but when I came out, I had what I described as a lesbian adolescence. I drank sort of out of control because I didn't have all the emotional maturity that I needed to carry me through my coming out process. So my drinking got out of hand. When I got sober, then I was able to better manage my life. And then unfortunately, suicidal ideation and attempts are sometimes common in the coming out process. Next slide. Intersectionality. This is really important, and gratefully, there's more attention being paid to this particular phenomenon. The interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or advantage. For example, a woman of color who is also transgender may experience changes in their economic status, education, may affect their race, their gender identity, and or their sexual orientation. Truly knowing and understanding another person requires an awareness of their intersecting identities. This graphic kind of shows the many ways that aspects of ourselves can intersect with other aspects of ourselves. And when we're dealing with LGBTQ 101 issues or race or substitute any other, we are not a single issue. So for example, for myself, I have some privilege as a white person, as in the same way that Kristi described, but on the same hand, as an intersex person, I have an invisible, what some people would consider to be disability, even though I consider it to be my normal. I have some issues related to my upbringing as far as my class. I was brought up in a very working class environment, both blue collar, both parents worked. I had to work at a very young age. So you can see that there are many different parts of who we are that make us who we are. Next slide, please. So here's the silver lining. Negative outcomes are not intrinsic to LGBTQ people, but are actually consequences of the ways in which LGBTQ people are treated in our culture. We are, by experience, resilient, politically, socially, and emotionally. LGBTQ people are often more well-connected and have stronger support systems that are outside of their chosen nuclear families. So for me, I created a chosen family, particularly when I was early in recovery. I wanted to be supported by other LGBTQ people who are also in recovery and understood some of the challenges I was experiencing. Gratefully, I have good relationships today with both my bio family and my chosen family, and I'm accepted by my bio family wholeheartedly. So I'm very grateful for that. That's part of the resilience that we have. One of the things that comes up a lot of times in conversations is I have continued ongoing relationships with some of my ex-partners. Sometimes people will say, you mean you're friends with your ex and they're still in your life today and you do things together and you get together for the holidays? And they are kind of surprised because some heterosexual people, and of course this is a generalization, may not share that experience and are surprised when they hear how LGBTQ people really put a lot of effort into nurturing relationships with the people who've been part of their lives. Next slide, please.
Okay, I'm going to talk just a little bit about how to be an ally to the LGBTQ plus community. So an ally is just someone who is not LGBTQ, but who respects their LGBTQ neighbors, coworkers, family members, and friends. And like we said earlier, you do this by using a person's identified names and identified pronouns and asking rather than making assumptions. It's always okay to say, would you mind sharing your identity or your pronouns with me? As long as it's said in kindness and politeness, you're usually going to get a really good response from the other person. Allies are people who are, number one, aware of their privilege, and two, use that privilege to advocate on behalf of marginalized populations. So we talked about intersecting identities and forms of privilege. I like this graphic because it's another form of kind of checking your privilege. And I'll be sending a copy of this presentation out to you later on, so that if you want to come back and check some of the things that we've talked about, you're welcome to do so on your own. But I have the privilege of being a native English speaker, of being cis, of being raised in a Christian environment, of being white, of a variety of these things. I check a number of these boxes. I have a lot of privilege. And that just means when I see someone else having their privilege not being validated, not being not being validated, it's my responsibility to speak up and to say something and to do something on that person's behalf. So using your privilege just entails acknowledging that, for me anyway, there are some things I will never experience or ever even have to think about. I will never know the full impact of what it is to be a person of color, to be a poor person, to be a trans person in this culture. And like I said, if you encounter a situation that can be rectified, at least I try to use my privilege to be political and to intervene if somebody's being treated badly. I try to listen and validate the things that marginalized individuals are saying. That doesn't mean I have to just wholeheartedly agree with what they're saying, but it does mean that I can empathize. I can try to find experience that they're talking about that I can relate to, and find areas where we can come together in mutual respect for each other. And that's, I think, what listening and validating is about. And I try to avoid talking over those who are speaking. Part of being an ally is educating yourself. If you want to know more about an LGBTQ plus topic, watch Netflix, read books, go to movies, talk to people. But it's not up to the LGBTQ plus individual to educate others. It's up to the individual to educate themselves. And this is true for any marginalized population: African American, Indigenous, Latinx, as well as LGBTQ. Using the appropriate pronouns and names is a great way to show that you're an ally. It's asking about and using the names and pronouns. I know we've repeated this a lot, but it shows respect and acceptance. When in doubt, use they, their, and theirs, and ask. If you're not able to ask, use they, their, and theirs as a default. The pronoun it and its does not describe a gender. It's ungendered. And so it's best to just avoid its when you're referring to another human being. So here are some samples of pronouns. You can see the basic she, her, hers, herself, but you can see there are several more here, and there are many more than this. But for example, the pronouns they, them, theirs, and themselves. They are an activist. I am proud of them. That is their book. That book is theirs. That person likes themselves. It's a little bit like learning a new language, but once you've done it a couple times, it gets a little easier. Be aware of microaggressions in becoming an ally. These are subtle but offensive actions or comments aimed at a marginalized community. They're often unintentional, but not always. And for the LGBTQ plus community, they can consist of expectations that cisgender people take for granted. So some common microaggressions, we've talked about using heterosexist and transphobic terminology, some of the terms that you don't want to use and you do want to use and you do want to ask. There's endorsement of the male-female binary. It's just as easy to ask, is your partner here, as it is to ask a woman, is your husband here? It just takes a little adjusting. And so, when you ask someone about their child, you ask them about their child, not their son or their daughter, because their daughter may have a different gender, a different gender. There's the assumption that all LGBTQ plus folks have the same experience. That's not true. We are just as heterogeneous within this community as the heterosexual community is. There's discomfort or disapproval of the LGBTQ plus experience. So if you find yourself feeling uncomfortable with some aspect of someone's gender identity or sexual orientation, or sex assigned at birth, again, try to empathize with where that person's coming from, find experiences that you can relate to, and base your judgment of that person on that empathy rather than your disapproval or discomfort. Assumption of sexual pathology and abnormality, that was more a thing of previous decades, although there are in certain places, in certain parts of our culture, still those assumptions. And denial of bodily privacy. So especially for trans people, not allowing trans people to use dressing rooms, bathrooms, asking trans people about their surgeries and their hormone treatment. Those are denials of bodily privacy, and those are considered microaggressions. So finally, the last thing is to just remember that mistakes happen, and we all make them. We make them in the community, we make them outside the community. It just happens. And it's a learning experience for all of us as things continue to change. And just apologize and be willing to move on. So that concludes the presentation. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can, there we go. So that we can view the gallery, and I will, if you want to put questions. There's one question in the chat. Does trans man equal female to male? Yes, that's correct. And a trans woman is male to female. So it's the resulting gender identity that you use the pronoun for. So does anybody have any other comments or questions that they'd like to ask?
I just want to remind everyone that I am open to all kinds of questions. I am very transparent, and part of my job as a advocate is to advocate for my community, but also to advocate for my own health, both mental and physical. So I'm very open if someone has any questions. There is a question here that Heidi asked. So if someone uses they, them pronouns, the proper verb conjugation is they are, not they is. Yes, I'm not a grammar expert, but that would be what I would assume. That it would be they are, not they is. They is sounds a little awkward.
I saw a couple of hands up, but I just wanted to jump in real quick. I need to get down to the sanctuary to get ready for worship for the second service. First, to thank the two of you for your presentation and your work. And I think I might be sharing the gender bear graphic in our weekly email next week. I think that was very helpful. Good. So thank you for that. And stating the obvious here, as people may be fully aware, there are multiple families in Covenant Presbyterian Church who are dealing with the spectrum of orientations, identities, situations that have been talked about. So I'm glad that we are doing this, that we're having these conversations. And just real quick, just to this is maybe a conversation for another day, but there's some interesting dialogue that there has been for a long time, and it's moving farther, dialogue about how to appropriately describe God and what pronouns to use for God in terms of Trinitarian thinking. There's more and more voices saying that we should use they pronouns for God, although I saw a comment the other day said the only pronoun for God is God. So a little food for thought there. Thanks both for being here. Joe is hosting the meeting, so I'm gonna scoot out.
Also, I want to say that I am also open to questions about my experience as a lesbian in coming out, or any questions you might have about or that. There are a couple more questions in the chat. Be aware that pronouns are fluid. I have a friend who wants to use it, they. That is very true. And a lot of people use he, they, or she, they when they, and it's all a matter of using the pronouns that the person asks you to use, and being respectful and asking. And then there's one other comment. Heidi says that she has several students who told her that she can use any pronouns, which leaves her lost as to which pronouns to use. I would use they and theirs, but you know, if they've told you you can use any, then they're going to be comfortable with whatever you say.
I would use their name.
Mm-hmm.
And then Melissa has her hand raised. Melissa, do you want to say a verbal question?
Yeah, so I struggle, I guess, with the terminology of queer. Has that changed?
Yes.
Whether or not it is derogatory over time?
Yes.
And is it patently not derogatory at this point?
It depends on, for older LGBT, like when I was young, somebody called me a queer a couple times, and I was mortified. It was a very shameful thing to call somebody. But the younger generation of LGBTQ plus folks have kind of embraced the term and made it their own. So for older LGBTQ plus folks, probably gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender would probably be a better way to refer. Oh, the over 50 group. But for under 50, you could probably use the queer community. And a lot of older people are getting more comfortable with the term queer.
I would
So
like to
I would
add
something
I
else.
would like to add that the younger community has embraced the term queer as being more all-encompassing of the whole spectrum of identities, much in the way that gay used to be.
Okay.
But gay had an association typically with males, and so queer has more of a gender neutral association with the whole spectrum of identities. So most people now, as Kristi indicated, except for maybe a few baby boomers of my generation, I'm not included in this group, will embrace queer as a affirming term.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
You want to take the next comment in the chat, Linda?
Sure, let me take a look. So this is from Barb.
We had one from Mark a few minutes before that, if you want to scroll up.
Oh, okay. I'm happy to do that. All right, Mark says, I have a niece who is married to another woman. They have a wonderful relationship. They have 2 beautiful children. We usually spend family holidays with them and their parents. How can I best be an advocate for them? Well, it sounds like by showing up, enjoying the family celebration and holiday, being as natural as you can be or feel comfortable being, is all that it really needs to take. You know, it sounds like you already believe they have a wonderful relationship and that they have 2 beautiful children, which you, I'm assuming, consider to be your grandnieces or grandnephews, depending on the gender of their children. And that, yeah, it sounds like you are probably already doing what you need to do by being accepting and showing up and celebrating those holidays with them. I don't think you have to go out of your way to make a statement unless there are family members who are trying to not acknowledge or tolerate that relationship. And then they might need you to be an ally and advocate for them. So Kristi, you want to take the next question then?
Sure. Barb says that she has a niece who's now trans, and she's wondering if watching old movies at a gathering makes her uncomfortable because it shows them before they transition to a man. However, not to show the old movies takes away something from everyone else at the family gathering. And Barb is realizing that she should ask them if they're comfortable and show any family movies when they aren't there if it makes them uncomfortable, which I think is a really great solution. It kind of addresses everybody's needs, and yet it honors your niece's experience as a trans man.
I also think it's important that when showing those movies, that person does not become the center of attention. That, you know, I come from a family where we have a lot of teasing and sarcasm and sometimes crooked communication. And that could be a problem if, when watching those movies, which can sometimes bring out that behavior in any family, if that person who's transitioned, it becomes the center of attention.
Good point. Thank you.
Any more questions or comments for the chat?
And people can also raise their hand like Melissa did. I'm assuming we answered your question, Melissa, correct?
That's correct. Thank you. Oh, yeah, I
Okay.
should take that off. Sorry.
Yep, that's okay.
And thank you again very much for doing this.
Sure.
Very, very informative, very thoughtful.
I do, while we're kind of in a lull, a few housekeeping items. This will be on YouTube in the next little bit, however long it takes to download, probably as early as next week. Then there's a note in the chat as well, if you'd like to join the talkback session at noon, especially if you were at the 9 o'clock service or you're going to the 11 o'clock service, where we'll be talking more about idolatry, or kind of wherever folks want to continue this, if it's this conversation or about the sermon.
Well, I personally want to thank everyone for being present today and asking questions and being gracious hosts. And I'm hosts and hostesses. I don't know if there's a generic term for that. That's not gender specific. So whatever that new term is, I would like to be able to start practicing that. So thank you for allowing us to come visit with you today and share this information as part of your series. And I personally want to say that I commend you at exploring the whole continuum of the subject of sex, because I imagine you've had some pretty interesting topics already, and we'll have some more. So thank you very much for inviting Kristi and I to present today. And
Thank you.
I can be contacted, and Kristi can be contacted by the information that's provided at the beginning of the presentation. And I'm assuming that that will be distributed to anyone who's interested in it. So don't hesitate to call or email. You can also visit us on the OutReach website, which is OutReach's website is LGBT outreach.org.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure presenting, and we're so glad that you invited us to present to you. And like Linda said, if you have any questions, any concerns, you don't have to be a member of the LGBTQ community to call OutReach or to use us as a resource. And if you are a member, then we would love to meet you at some point. So thank you, and be well, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.